Steve Hindle assumed the directorship of research at the Huntington Library in July of 2011, after 16 years as the professor in the Department of History at the University of Warwick. He is the author of 2 books, The State and Social Change in Early Modern England in 2000, and On the Parish in 2004. And he's also written numerous scholarly articles on patterns of social relations in English rural communities. He was also the editor of Remaking English Society, Social Relations, and Social Change in Modern England in 2013. He is currently working on a long-term project to reconstruct the pattern of social and economic relations in an exceptionally well-documented 17th century English village. He is originally from Warrington, an industrial town on the River Mersey between Liverpool and Manchester in the northwest of England, and holds a BA and PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, though the two were punctuated by a master's degree in history and political science from the University of Minnesota. He came to Southern California with his wife Louise, who is chair of the Academic Advisory Council for SMUSD, but unfortunately cannot be here tonight, and 3 children, Thomas, age 16, Joseph, age 13, and the Empress, Olivia, age 9, all of whom are in San Marino Public Schools. Thomas, the oldest, is a junior at San Marino High School and is actually here tonight. He is sports editor of the Titan Shield newspaper and a contributing writer to the San Marino Tribune, reporting to Mitch Lehman. He will be covering tonight's event. He is also known for making the deciding penalty kick in San Marino High's CIF soccer playoffs versus St. Margaret's. It was the Titans' first playoff appearance in more than a decade. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to Steve Hindle.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. Thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to see so many people in the room, and especially to see so many familiar faces. It's a measure of my integration and the Hindle family's integration into the San Marino community that there are so many very familiar faces here this evening. So what I'd like to do over the next 15-20 minutes before David starts to interrogate me is to do 2 things. First of all, to explain something about the activities of the research division at the Huntington. You will all know that the Huntington is a world-renowned garden, a world-renowned museum, and a world-renowned art collection. But it's the research division and the scholarly research that takes place within the research division for which I'm responsible. And it's one of the great secrets of the institution. It's not very transparent to the outside world. So I hope to shed some light upon it for you over the next 8 or 10 minutes. After that, I'll explain how it is that somebody from my background, who'd never been west of the Mississippi before he was interviewed for this position at the Huntington in 2011, came to hold the directorship of research in this institution. So I'll do those 2 things, and after that, David, anything is fair game. Okay? So, the cliche, you've probably heard it repeated many times, but like most cliches, it bears repetition, is that if you imagine a coffee table with 3 volumes on that coffee table, one of those volumes is the best library collection in the world. The second is the best botanical garden in the world. And the third is the best art collection in the world. Then the Huntington would be the only institution that would have a reasonable claim to be in all 3 volumes. And I think that's very, very telling about the peculiar nature of a collections-based research institution where the collections extend not only to library, but also to gardens and also to art. But there's no point in an institution like this having collections of any kind unless they are mobilized. Now, of course, the gardens are mobilized. The gardens are the big draw. We have 600,000 visitors a year come to this institution. The vast majority of them come to relax and spend time in the gardens. 70% of them never go in any building, not even into the art collections. But the crucial thing from my point of view is to mobilise the library collection, to put the library collection in the hands of scholars. After all, what would be the point of having a collection that extends to 9 million manuscripts and 800,000 rare books if they were just sitting in a basement? And the basement is pretty big. Underneath your feet, you probably don't know this, but underneath your feet there is an acre of basement storage, 24,000 square feet of library storage space for collections that the Huntington doesn't even own yet. So this education and visitor centre was built with the growth of the collections in mind. But the key thing is to animate those collections, put them in the hands of scholars and give scholars the opportunity to work on them. The best example I can give you is a relatively recently acquired collection that came to us in 2008. This is the Burndy Library. Anybody heard of the Burndy Library at all? Okay, so there are in the Burndy Library 68,000 rare books in the history of science, medicine and technology, dating from the medieval period through to the 19th century. It's almost impossible to value that collection, but the best estimate is in excess of $100 million. It came to us as a gift from the Dibner family, who were growing increasingly frustrated that its former home at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology wasn't making the most of the collection. So they started to look for alternative homes for the Burndy Library. At the time, the Huntington had recently constructed the Munger Research Centre with its new library storage, so we had the space to accommodate the Burndy Library. Several people in this room were in the conversation with the Dibner family about that gift. And it was pointed out to the Dibner family that there was no possibility that the Huntington would take this collection of 68,000 rare books unless it came with substantial support for cataloguing, curating, programming and research fellowships. So the Dibner family said, well, where are you going to get that from? And we said, you. So the upshot was that it cost the Dibner family $16 million to give their collection of rare books to the Huntington. And that's an interesting story, I think, that emphasises the significance to us of mobilising the collections. So it's now the case that every year as Director of Research, I get the opportunity to award 2 full years of research fellowship and 20 months of research fellowship to scholars in the Dibner programme, in the history of science and technology, who want to spend time exploiting those collections. But that's only part of the story. Each year, the research division gives away $2 million in research grants to 200 scholars from all over the world who want to use our collections. The vast majority of that sum is held in restricted endowments within our own funds. Only 7% of all that funding comes from other sources, specifically from the federal government in the form of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So this is a self-sustaining research operation. It results in what is, I think, the largest, most generous and most competitive research fellowship operation in the United States. Each year we receive between 600 and 700 applications from scholars who want to use the collections. Some of them want to be here for the whole year, some of them want to be here for a period of 3 months or less. None of them want to leave once they have spent some time here. The Huntington Research Division fosters a culture of dependency, some would say addiction, with scholars wanting to return again and again and again. As Director of Research, one of the worst questions you can ask any scholar who is in residence here is, how much longer have you got? Because it's kind of like talking to somebody on death row. Scholars really do not want to go back to their own universities. And I'll explain something about the atmosphere that is fostered around the collections later, because that's crucial to the success of the institution. I say that lots of people apply to conduct research here, and that's critical. Of the 200 awards that we make in any given year, only 5 are awarded without people having to apply. Those 5 are our distinguished fellowships, which go to really senior scholars in the fields where the Huntington collections are strong: history, literature, history of art, and history of science. And those 5 individuals are here at my invitation, which is another way of saying that the filthy stream of patronage runs right through the Director of Research's office. So I can hand these things out to my mate. Sorry, no. What I do is I take advice from the leading scholars in the field about who the most appropriate candidates for those positions are. Everybody else has to apply. And we put those applications through an extremely robust and rigorous process of peer review. The credibility of the research programme at the Huntington depends on making sure that only the brightest and the best get the opportunity to conduct research in our collections. And it takes 4 separate committees each year, meeting every Saturday in February here at the Huntington to make those decisions about which of those applications are strongest. I could say more about the process if you like, but the critical thing is that that selection process is not a virtual one. It doesn't take place digitally. It doesn't take place as a conference call. It takes place in the Keck conference room in the research suite just outside my office. So there's real blood on a real carpet rather than virtual blood on a virtual carpet. And that's a large number of applications, and then to come to the Huntington to be prepared to evaluate them. It's a measure of the prestige of the programme that none of those peer reviewers who come here to make those decisions have ever declined the invitation to participate. We pay them a very, very modest stipend, we give them a nice dinner, we reimburse their expenses. But they come, well, partly because they want to be in Southern California in February, and who wouldn't, but they come largely because they want to be associated with such a prestigious programme. The happiest day of the year for me in any given cycle is the first Saturday in February. Because after the peer review committee is concluded, at about 3 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, I get to pick the phone up and make phone calls to 10 individuals who've been successful in our long-term fellowship application. And some of the reactions I've had to those phone calls are really rather interesting. There was one young woman, a faculty member at Texas Tech in Lubbock, who I happened to catch in the parking lot at Costco. And she thought, 626? What's 626? And then I started to speak, and you could hear her thinking, why is this strange Brit phoning me at this time on a Saturday afternoon? So I explained that I was Director of Research at the Huntington, and I'd like to offer her a long-term fellowship to spend the year in residence, and she started shrieking hysterically down the phone. Apparently, within seconds of the phone going down, she was rapidly texting all her friends who were already in residence at the Huntington, saying, was this a hoax? Is the Director of Research really Steve Hindle? Did he just phone me? So you can imagine how rewarding it is for me to make those phone calls, and how delightful it is to hear the enthusiasm of those scholars. What do they do when they're here? Well, they spend lots and lots of time in the collections. We are a collections-based research institute. They sit in the rare books reading room, they transcribe material, they take notes from material, they photograph material increasingly, and they write. And over the last 20 years, the scholars who have spent a full year in residence at the Huntington have produced between them about 150 scholarly monographs in history, literature, art history, and the history of science. Several of those volumes have been major prize winners, including Pulitzer Prizes. Others have won prizes from the North American Conference on British Studies, the Organisation of American Historians, the Western History Association, etc., etc., etc. So we do care about outputs. We do care that people publish books as a consequence of the time that they spend here. But the real measure of success is the conversation that those scholars have with one another while they are here. My job as Director of Research is to facilitate a scholarly conversation amongst the researchers who are in residence. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so ambivalent about the digitisation of our collections. It may be that digitisation was an idea that was in your mind and that you might want to ask about. I do not want scholars to sit in Kenilworth and Krakow and Canberra and to be able to read our manuscripts from thousands and thousands of miles away. That's not in our interest. What is in our interest is for those scholars to come here and sit round the table in the cafe or sit in the seminar room and talk about what it is that they've been reading while they've been working on the collections. Our best policy, until very, very recently, and I'm going to try and overturn it if I get the chance, our best policy was to close the reading room at lunchtime, to force the scholars out into the garden and make them talk to one another, because that's where the genuine scholarly interaction takes place. And it's those spontaneous conversations between two scholars who've never met before but happen to have cognate interests. That's where the real intellectual excitement and intellectual electricity takes place. I hope you can sense that I still haven't recovered from the enthusiasm and the thrill of having the privilege of holding this position. It is a remarkable position, a prestigious position, a well-resourced position, a very high-profile position, and I still feel extraordinarily privileged to be in this role. So, as David Byrne once said, how did I get here? So I come from a very humble working class background in Northern England. Like many people of my generation, I'm born 1965. I'm first generation college. At the time I went to university in 1983, only 7% of the high school population went to university at all, and only a really tiny proportion went to the elite universities of Oxford or Cambridge. The reason I went to university at all was because I had, like this 16-year-old sitting over here, inspirational teachers in high school. And at the age of 14, I wrote an essay on the kind of journal that Christopher Columbus might have kept as he sailed west. And on the bottom of that essay, my high school history teacher wrote, Oxbridge, ? And I'd never heard the phrase before. And I went home to share with my parents, and they'd never heard the phrase before. It's the English equivalent of Ivy League. And that teacher, over the next 5 years, really encouraged me to think seriously about going to university to study history. And in fact, with his advice, I gained a place at Cambridge University in 1983. I did 3 years there, and then came to the States in 1986. It's a long story how I came to be in Minneapolis, and I can share it with you if you wish. But I did a history degree, history and political science master's degree between 86 and 88. And the Twins also won the World Series while I was there, which is my introduction to baseball, which, as Tom will tell you, has been critically important in the Hindle assimilation to Southern California. From there, back to Cambridge to do my doctorate, then a postdoc, and then to a faculty position at the University of Warwick from 1995 to 2011. Had 3 wonderful children, very happily married, Louise teaching in a very, very good high school in Warwickshire. I thought I would spend the rest of my career there. And then one day in September 2010, I received a letter in my mailbox in the history department at the university. And even in 2010, that was pretty remarkable because nobody sends you letters anymore, even in 2010. This letter had a Huntington postmark on it. And I hadn't applied for anything at the Huntington. I'd never been to the Huntington. I knew of Huntington collections because you can't do the kind of history that I do, and I can say more about that later if you like, without knowing about the Huntington collections. Inside that envelope was a letter from a guy of whom I'd never heard, Dr. Stephen S. Koblick, inviting me to apply for the position of Director of Research at the Huntington, for whom my name had been suggested as a suitable candidate. And I just burst out laughing. I thought it was hilarious. I took it home, I showed it to Louise, and she burst out laughing too. She thought it was hilarious. And then she did what any good wife would do in that situation. She poured me a large glass of Chardonnay, and she said, try and draft a letter of interest. And I drafted a letter of interest. It took me 25 minutes to write that letter. And I thought, if I can do that quickly, that's quite interesting. High research profile, 2 well-received books, editor of the Economic History Review, lots of conference programming on both sides of the Atlantic, an American master's degree, critically, because I don't think you could do this job without having some experience of American higher education. So the short version of what happened next is that I put that letter in the post. I also copied an email as well, of course. And within 3 weeks, I'd been invited for an interview in New York City. I'd never been to New York City before. I'd shared this information with Tom. Tom had never heard of the Huntington Library, and he had no idea what the competition was. Never heard of some of the scholars who were also in the running for this position. But he was convinced right from the very outset that I was going to get the job. So he was on board. He was my best advocate. And we can hear from Tom later, if you like, about how he went through this whole experience. I spent an hour and a half in Lauren Rothschild's apartment in New York City with Steve Koblick and 3 of the trustees. And during that hour and a half, I didn't get a word in edgeways. They did all the talking. And I remember walking away from that interview thinking, well, if that was my chance to sell myself, I've blown it completely. I'll never hear from these people again. Only in retrospect did it become clear to me that what was happening was that they were trying to tell me as much as they possibly could about the institution with a view to a second interview, because they knew I knew nothing about the Huntington. 3 days after coming back from New York, I had an email asking me whether I'd take a phone call, and in that phone call, Steve asked me to come out here in January as one of the final 4 candidates. And at that point, I did the only intelligent thing I did throughout the whole process, which was to say, yes, I'd love to come, but only if you bring my wife out with me. Because I got the sense already that family was very important to the Huntington as an institution. And also I wanted to make it clear to Steve and the trustees that I wasn't messing about. I wasn't trying to get leverage out of Warwick. I was genuinely interested, and that this would be a family decision. During that 5 days, and Randy will remember it well, in January 2011, I was really put through the ringer. The easy bit was the fact that the temperature differential between London Heathrow and LAX was 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was exceptionally cold in London and exceptionally warm here. I was subjected to breakfast meetings, lunch meetings, presentations, talks, dancing with the trustees, you name it. It all happened. And of course I was seriously jet lagged and totally in awe of the institution, because I couldn't quite believe what it was that I was seeing. At the end of the week, I said to Louise, this might sound a bit strange because I know I'm the complete outsider for this, but I might have given myself a chance here. And she said, well, good. And we sat in a restaurant on Colorado Boulevard, Mia Piace, having breakfast. And it was the furthest time and the longest time and the furthest distance that we'd ever been away from the kids. But I looked at Louise across the breakfast table and I thought, you don't want to go home, do you? She'd had such a fantastic time. And I said, well, you know, what would happen if I was offered this position? And she said, well, you'd take it, wouldn't you? So right from it, Louise was on side. Steve Koblick said to me, and this is early January 2011, we'd like to think that you would make a quick decision if you were offered this position at the end of January. Sure enough, he phoned me at the end of January, offered me the position, and I said yes there and then. And 5 months after that, we emigrated. So the whole process took between September the 10th and July the 1st. Absolutely amazing. And it is, well, I've had a wonderful time doing the job, but it's immense credit, I think, to Steve Koblick that he was prepared to take a gamble on a complete outsider, on a fresh pair of eyes who would bring something new to the research division. I'll conclude my story by saying that people often say to me that it's remarkable how well the Hindle family, Louise and Tom and Joe and Olivia, have settled at the Huntington. It isn't really remarkable at all, because this isn't Omaha, Nebraska. Sorry, is there anybody here from Omaha, Nebraska? It is a really remarkable environment. My experience has been very, very different than it would have been had I come in as a faculty member at USC or UCLA. To come into a small institution that really wrapped its arms around us, made us feel welcome, an institution that sits at the heart of a community where it's been so relatively easy to get to know people. On the baseball bleachers, having the privilege of meeting John Ryan or Greg Cribbs, it's been really fantastic to get to meet like-minded people who share our enthusiasm for the Huntington as a centre of learning and recreation. I'm sure you'll have loads of questions, and I'm very happy to answer them, either from you or from David.
And we did, anyone hear me? We have a few questions to ask. The first one is, you've become the preeminent expert on the history of society and economy of the 17th century with a focus on the perspective of common people. Mm-hmm. How did you decide to specialize in this field? Okay,
so the kind of history that I practice is really popularly known as history from below. It had its birth in the 1960s in England, and specifically at the University of Warwick, which is coincidentally where I worked. It's a very famous and radical social and political campaigner and historian called Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, the author of a very famous book called The Making of the English Working Class. And when I was a teenager, I was first introduced to Thompson's work, and it proved to be really inspirational to me. It was part of Thompson's achievement as a historian to say, we've heard enough about kings and queens and bishops and presidents. It's about time we heard about not just the winners in the process of history, but also the losers in the process of history. And it's part of our duty as historians, he wrote, to rescue the losers, and this is a very famous phrase, but it bears repetition, to rescue the losers from the enormous condescension of posterity. And that to me was a rallying cry, and much of my publication over the last 25 years has been about subordinates, about the oppressed, about the labouring poor, about those who didn't have enough to eat or didn't have enough to pay the rent or had to take their caps off before meeting the landlord. I'm really interested in below stairs history, if you're into your Downton Abbey. Think of it as a below stairs vision of how history should be written. So it's really a consequence of reading that kind of work when I was a student and trying to practice it to the best of my ability.
Okay. Being an individual new to the U.S., you could have easily chosen to hunker down and lose yourself in your work. Yet with 3 kids at 3 different SMUSD schools, you become quite active in the community, often making yourself available to speak at events such as Career Day. In addition, your wife Louise currently serves as the chair of the SMUSD Academic Advisory Committee. Was it a conscious decision to immerse yourself in the San Marino community?
That's a very interesting question. So we've had friends, Louise and I have had friends who've become expats in other parts of the world, specifically in Europe. And I remember not long before we came here, friends of ours moved to Brussels in Belgium. And the guy, Sam Everett, has a very high-profile career as a lawyer and very, very busy and very highly overcommitted. And I remember him saying to me that we made an active choice not to let the kids do any sport, because that would prevent the family doing stuff at the weekends. And Louise and I decided not long after we got here that it was clear, given the wonderful atmosphere and the high degree of organisation of sport and recreation in the San Marino area, that we'd just throw ourselves into it. So Joe, who's not here this evening, he's now 13. He's played club soccer for LAFC. Olivia is a very keen gymnast. She's also been involved in the Pasadena Ballet. Tom has played basketball and baseball. So we're outnumbered, right, by our children. There are more of them than us. And we really did recognise that it was in their interest and also in our interest, because we saw fairly early on that we'd get to meet lots of people from outside my professional circle by being involved very heavily in sports. Louise and I are also very committed to the support of the school district. As David says, I've spoken twice now at Career Day. For the last 4 years, I've done a presentation to Hannah Fong's middle school social studies class. I never, ever, ever turn down an invitation to speak anywhere, because part of my professional ethic is to try and give back and to try and inspire in the way that I was inspired. And Louise shares that view. I mean, as you can imagine, as a mother of 3 children with a fairly pressurised part-time job, you know, the decision to become involved in the Academic Advisory Council wasn't taken lightly, least of all to become its chair. So that's a measure of just how committed we have been to participating in the local community.
In addition to your active involvement, all 3 of your kids are both accomplished athletes and scholars. How are you able to create this incredible balance?
So there is a sporting gene in the family. So my father's a very interesting man. He died in 1994, sadly. So my mum's been widowed quite a long time. My dad was a professional sportsman. He played rugby for England. When I go back to my hometown now, I still occasionally meet people who say, "Hindle, are you any relation?" Which is kind of nice. I was a reasonably good soccer player at school. I was captain of my college team, but never had the possibility of really playing to a high level. But the sporting gene has been inherited by all 3 of the kids. He's a very good soccer player. His younger brother is an even better soccer player. I'm really hoping that they'll play on the same varsity soccer team at San Marino High School next year, with Joe as a freshman and Tom as a senior. That would be really great if that happened. And as I say, Olivia is a keen gymnast. We've been really impressed with the level of teaching and education in the school district, and very impressed by the demands made on the kids in scholarly terms. It is amazing to us just how carefully so many families in the San Marino School District balance out the scholarly and the sporting to very, very high levels of attainment. And we are doing our very best to emulate that level of success. The most important thing for us, though, David, is that the kids are happy. And, you know, Tom may wish to speak to that. You know. Take the mic in a minute.
Can you discuss some of the time commitments for the Huntington that take you away from your family? And is there anything that you do in particular that helps you achieve a daily connection to your family?
Okay, so you can imagine that in my particular role, I spend a great deal of time socialising with scholars, hosting scholars, being at talks, introducing lectures. The fact that we've got the new Ritchie Auditorium in the Rothenberg Hall means that the lecture programme is growing all the time. I host 25 public lectures in that space every year, 7 academic conferences. I do a whole series of programmes with the Society of Fellows here at the Huntington, of which several of you are members. The best estimate is that means 55 nights a year of entertaining for me. So I eat and drink for the Huntington. And no wonder Louise is talking about the Huntington 15. That is to say, the £15 that I put on since I took the job. That said, one of my greatest pleasures and the way that I relax is cooking. And even when I'm not eating with the family, I always love to cook for them. So even this evening, I left the Huntington at 4 p.m. and I cooked dinner for the family before coming back out. Yesterday, I had to be on the west side in Bel Air for a Huntington Circle salon. I went home at lunchtime and cooked Jamie Oliver's Moroccan lamb with ginger and chickpeas, which the kids had for dinner last night. And I just like to do that. That's the right thing to do. It's also great fun. Really great fun.
I'm very thankful my wife is not here today.
Well, tell her,
The
David.
Huntington is a wonderful resource for the community. In addition to being San Marino's largest generator of sales tax revenue, the Huntington is also a supporter of SMFF, and also sponsors a number of educational programs. That said, how would you rate the level of collaboration between the Huntington and SMUSD, and what are the greatest areas of opportunity?
So that's a really interesting question. I think the educational program at the Huntington is growing all the time. Under the leadership of my colleague Catherine Olgor, there are more and more initiatives going on. You may have read about the teacher training initiative with the Pasadena Unified School District. There's also the partnership with Torres Esteban High School. But also there are a number of programs that have been invigorated over the last 2 years with the high school, more and more high school students in particular coming through the Huntington for curator-led programs, and I think that's a very welcome development. From my point of view as Director of Research though, one of the disappointing things and the thing that I would really like to work on to see improvement is the presence at our evening lectures of so few high school students a year, many of them in academic areas on themes that are cognate with the high school curriculum. So for instance, just to name a couple of examples in the last 2 months, we had a lecture on the American Revolution which focused on the failure of British military leadership during the American Revolution. Don't worry, we weren't trying that hard, you know. Our eyes were on India. But nonetheless, there were nearly 400 people in the room to hear Andrew O'Shaughnessy from Monticello give that lecture. And it was really disappointing to me that there were so few high school students present. So what I would really like to do is to reach out to the high school staff and to encourage further participation of high school students in our evening public programs. And I know these kids are very instrumental about their grades. He's very instrumental about his grades. But the opportunity to add value to one's classroom learning by hearing lectures like that, I think is absolutely extraordinary. And you know, I'm sad that he doesn't get to as many lectures as I would like.
So last question back from me before I turn it over to the audience. In your opinion, what is the greatest area of opportunity for the Huntington, and what do you believe is the appropriate call to action?
So there are many opportunities for the Huntington at the moment. I think one of them is in digital infrastructure. The fact that we have such a wonderful auditorium is going to mean that we do more and more public programs which will be oversubscribed. How many of you were here on Friday night last week? Just a couple. So Friday night last week is a very, very good example. In collaboration with Caltech, with the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences at Caltech and various science departments at Caltech, we hosted a conference here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the development of the theory of general relativity, Einstein at 100. And the public lecture as part of that conference was given by Professor Kip Thorne, who will almost certainly win a Nobel Prize for his role in the discovery of gravitational waves. That night, we had 400 people in the auditorium, 400 people in this room watching a simulcast of the lecture, and we turned 70 cars away at the gate because the talk was so highly oversubscribed. And it seems to me that that kind of programming is the new normal. We will have more and more programs that will be oversubscribed. And we need to start, I think, reaching out to an audience that cannot physically be present here, whether that means live streaming, webcasting, video archiving. The options are many and various, but I do think that we need to think about the institution not just catering for those who can physically be here to hear these programs, but also to those who can't. So I think digital infrastructure will make that kind of thing possible.
We've got a few moments. Is any questions from the audience?
As a Caltech person, I'd like to take this opportunity. This close to my mouth?
Yep.
As a Caltech person, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for being the lead person in setting up this joint conference with Caltech. I'd like to ask you to say a few more words about how that came about.
Okay.
And is it true that that was the first joint conference with that the Huntington Library has had with Caltech?
Okay, thank you for the question. So Caltech and the Huntington have shared a long history, and for many, many years the two institutions had histories that were entwined with one another. You may know that it was George Ellery Hale who first persuaded Henry Huntington to change the terms of his trust so that what was a private collection could become not just a gift to the state of California, but a research institution that has grown to its present scale. They had trustees in common. We have several collaborations with Caltech already, postdocs, joint professorships, but this initiative that took place last week was really the most ambitious of its kind, and certainly the fullest of its kind. And I would really like to think that it's a straw in the wind of further collaboration between the two institutions. The strengths in the faculty at Caltech in the history of science and technology, combined with the presence here of an enormous collection of material in the history of science and technology, means that it's a natural collaboration. And one of my ambitions really is to formalise that relationship into a joint advanced research institution, because I firmly believe that value is added where assets are pooled. Hi.
Do I get to talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to hear from Tom. I think we all would.
Hello. Hi. How can I help? Well, I'm doing well. I'm not quite sure what you want me to talk about, though.
Tell us something about yourself.
Okay, well, I guess I'll talk a bit about my move over here then. So, coming from a pretty rural, small town in England to Los Angeles was a huge, huge change for me. But the San Marino community has made it so much easier than it really should have been. Obviously, the weather, the environment made it very easy at first, having never really seen sunlight. But the people, especially with the Huntington, made it so much easier for me and my two siblings. I remember on the 4th of July, 3 days after we moved, we went to a baseball game. And that was the culture shock of being in America was absolutely insane. Someone who'd grown up on cricket, and I'll say soccer for now, to go to a baseball game that he didn't understand with 50,000 fans who definitely knew what they were talking about was a really, really interesting change for me. But it made my, I guess my introduction to American life a really pleasant one. Otherwise, kind of moving into the San Marino school system was very different. I've talked to quite a few people this evening about the differences between the English and the American school systems. The English school system, as a lot of people have kind of said to me or think that they kind of comes to mind, they think it's quite a more rigorous academic, very learning-based system. And in many ways that's true. But, you know, San Marino obviously has that combination of students getting excellent grades and really being pushed by their parents and teachers, and also having that, that extra, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but that extra push, I guess, from the teachers of really being encouraged to learn as well. So that was a great mix for me. And although my dad will probably back this up, there are a couple of rocky months on my GPA, I think I had a really successful assimilation into San Marino.
You mentioned Downton Abbey. What is your thought about the authenticity of that culture?
Okay, so the question is my view on the authenticity of Downton Abbey. So I should preface this answer by commenting on the fact that my ongoing research project, to which David referred in his introduction, is actually the study of an exceptionally well-documented landed estate. An estate not unlike the estate at Downton, though for the period 150 years previously. So I have a great deal of expertise in the history of master-servant relations, in the history of employee-employer relations in English history. I kind of watch Downton Abbey through my fingers, really, or more properly from behind my iPad. My wife absolutely loves it. She's addicted to it, and she's very upset that it's over. I have to say that I really admire the acting, and that's no surprise. Maggie Smith in particular, Jim Carter also. The cast is fantastic, and the acting is terrific. But my God, the plot lines. So slow, so repetitive. I mean, did anything change over 6 series? Really?
You're angering a lot of people in this room.
Well, yes. So, no, I'm not a big fan. Hi there.
A question about, help me understand the Huntington on the research side.
Sure.
You talked about the 10 fellows.
Yeah.
That come for a year-long.
Yeah.
Sojourn here.
Yeah.
Are there other people who have access to the library, and does the Huntington charge those academicians
Right.
to use them?
Thank you for the question. So the question's about the relationship between the grantees, the research fellows whose research we support, and then the wider constituency of scholars who use the collections. So the best way to think about this is that the research fellows who are funded by my department are only 10% of those who have readers' tickets for the institution. And of course, that larger constituency is overwhelmingly local. So faculty and graduate students from Claremont, from UCLA, from USC, from Caltech, from Loyola Marymount, from other local institutions. And no, we don't charge them for use of the collections. If they are properly credentialed, that is to say, if they are either a faculty member or an advanced graduate student, we will welcome them into the collections. And they are kind of the penumbra, as it were, around the core of research fellows funded by my department. But at the same time, they're very welcome to join that scholarly community that I was describing to you. So yes, 10% funded by my department, the remainder local.
Right.
Hi.
In light of Downton Abbey and others, and a TV watcher, can the Huntington ever do anything to improve the choices of content on American and English, which is my experience of English, content?
What, on television?
Your scholars and get them into Hollywood so that something can be changed.
So that's an interesting question. I was the first question that was asked of me during my interview after I gave my presentation on the relationship between master and servant at Arbury Hall in Warwickshire in the 1670s. And Randy will remember this. Susan Turner-Lowe, one of my colleagues who is Vice President for Communications, she turned to me, she said, "Well, the story you've told us is so fascinating and the characters are so vivid. Have you ever thought of talking to a Hollywood screenwriter?" And I said, well, let's face it, if I don't get this job, there'll always be the film rights. So I didn't need to go down that track. It is interesting, I think, that the presence on British television of high-profile academics, faculty members, trying to make their research accessible to the wider public is much more prominent than is the case here. There is a real fashion for academic history presented in an accessible way on British TV, to the extent that in 2010, one major broadsheet newspaper, The Observer in England, talked about history as the new rock and roll in England, which I thought was quite interesting. I'd like to see more of it. Sometimes you find that faculty members are a bit sniffy about it. They don't want to be seen to be dumbing their work down or trivialising it. One of the things that the Huntington does extremely well, I think, through its communications office, is give scholars the opportunity to blog about the research that they are doing here. And the communications office has a wonderfully skilled editor called Kevin Durkin, who wins the confidence of scholars very, very easily. And in partnership with them, he helps them make their scholarship accessible. And if you've never seen the Huntington blog, it's called Verso. It's very well worth subscribing to it, because it's really highlights from the front line of the research programme, in which a scholar will share their research in a very accessible way with the wider interested public.
You got another question for Tom?
Am I back? Okay.
That's all right.
I'm stealing the spotlight from my dad now. How can I help?
I first wanted to say I'm looking quite forward to meeting you and having a private talk with you sometime.
Okay.
I've had 40 years of high school students at San Marino High School, and having been one for 4 years. And I doubt that my peers, classmates, and all of the students I had, there were some, I'm sure, that could have perhaps been moved to England and been able to address an adult audience with the poise and articulation that you have in class. I found it most refreshing and most impressed by it.
Thank you.
At some point, we'll discuss soccer and football.
Okay.
And I understand you're playing baseball, is that correct?
I did play for a couple of years, but this year I was going to, but then 4 AP classes happened. So.
I was looking forward to come out and watching you play. Anyway, well, in that case, that part of my question about your participation in the various sports.
Well,
what it was like for you and so forth.
Well, so my freshman year, I did soccer and baseball, and I played baseball my sophomore year as well. But the San Marino soccer program has really been the big one for me. I don't know how many of you are familiar with San Marino soccer, and if you aren't, that's for good reason, because we usually suck. I had a debate with Bill Plaschke, journalist, writer for the LA Times, and I was at a journalism conference, and my question that I wanted to debate with him was, will soccer ever be a success in the United States? And me, of course, yes, let's go, soccer, I love it. He said, no. All the great athletes who would play soccer go to play wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers or point guard for the Los Angeles Lakers. And in a sense, he's right. And that's kind of what happens at San Marino High School. You have a number of good soccer players, but they're better football players, they're better basketball players. So I don't want to make excuses, but you're working from a limited pool from the start. My freshman and sophomore years, I had a bit of an interesting experience of kind of yo-yoing between varsity and JV. I've spent all 3 years thus far practicing with varsity, but my soccer coach my freshman year, in no uncertain terms, basically told me, Tom, you are not big enough to play varsity. Which, I mean, at first I was not very happy with, and Dad can support that, but it actually was a valuable experience to kind of move up through the ranks, and this year has just been an amazing season. We made CIF for the first time in over a decade, and we just had a lot of great players, but mostly the thing that was so special about this season is that we had 18 guys on the roster who genuinely liked each other. And my freshman and sophomore years, they were kind of cliquey, you know, the seniors stick together and they kind of give the freshmen a hard time. But this year, there was a family around it. And that's really what made the difference for me this year. And that's why we won that first playoff game in CIF against the team that was the number 3 seeded team in the whole CIF Southern section. We had no right to win that game. We had no right to win that game. They'd won the whole thing, I think, 2 years prior to this year. Ridiculously good school. 4 players committed to playing college. Whereas we have 1 player committed to playing college, and that is JP Shofi, who is going to play football at Yale. But it was an amazing game to be a part of. I said when I came home that that was the best night of my life, and that was for good reason, because I am never going to be involved in a sports team that was as exciting, as fun, or as passionate as that. Okay.
Any more questions for Steve Wartog?
Question for Steve. You talk about bringing 200, 300, or 400 scholars here in a year. And I know working with you, Liz and I have had the pleasure of having some of them stay as guests at our house.
Right.
That was wonderful. On the other hand, we've had to say no to a large number because we just don't have room.
Right.
I was wondering about how you house that number and what your future plans in that regard are.
Thank you for asking, Dennis. If there is anything that keeps me awake at night as Director of Research, it's the housing issue. How are we going to accommodate 200 scholars, 22, 23 of whom are here for the full academic year, the remainder for periods of 3 months or less? It's a real challenge. My office keeps a list of available accommodation, apartments, rooms and houses that we make available to scholars, and essentially we stand between prospective tenants and landlords, facilitating that conversation. It's very, very difficult to keep track of that available accommodation, and we certainly don't have the staff resources to operate anything like a booking system. So this is a system that was fit for purpose when the Research Fellowship Programme was about a third of the size that it is. We are immensely grateful to those people, some of them here in this room this evening, who are very happy to rent their rooms or apartments or houses to Huntington Research Fellows when they wouldn't contemplate putting them up for rent on the open market. And that's one measure of your dedication to and support for the institution, and we're very grateful. But I'm worried about a whole series of things. I'm worried about pressure on numbers and pressure on availability. I'm worried about liability. What happens if the landlady turns out to be a nymphomaniac? What happens if the research fellow turns out to be a kleptomaniac? You know, there are any number of difficulties that could arise from this situation, and I don't want to end up in court about it. So there needs to be a more radical solution to the housing problem. Some of you may know how the Getty Research Institute, which is one of our sister institutions, solves this problem. They have a residential centre for their scholars in residence for the whole year. And that serves the purpose not only of making it a very attractive fellowship to hold, because housing comes as part of the package, but it also means that my equivalent number at the GRI, at the Getty Research Institute, finds it much easier to build a scholarly community amongst those scholars in residence because they're living with one another. And I know that better fences sometimes make better neighbours, and you know, you can be sick of one another after living cheek by jowl for a year, but I think it would really make a critical difference to the success of the Huntington Research Programme if there was purpose-built housing for scholars through which we could rotate our research fellows as they came for a year or for shorter periods. But I don't think there is any easy and certainly any inexpensive solution to this problem. It's a great question.
I have a question about your comment on digitization.
Digitisation.
That it is not something that excites you much. However, you also mentioned that making those 69,000 books and more available to available to researchers.
Yes.
Couldn't your philosophy on collaborating as scientists and making the collection available to the world through digitization go together? Right,
that's a very, very interesting question. So we certainly do want to make the material available to scholars. And the whole point of the Research Fellowship Programme is to do that. The argument for digitising our collections would be much stronger if we didn't have $2 million a year to give away to scholars to come here and physically look at them. That's not to say that we don't digitise at all. We often digitise to conserve and to protect, especially our very valuable or extremely rare or very scholars, because we want to protect it and conserve it. I think the middle way is what I would call making the collections discoverable. Discoverability is the watchword. That is to say that I'm quite happy for you to sit in Kenilworth or Krakow or Canberra and to be able to search our catalogues online so that you can see what type of material is held here. And if that helps you make the case when you apply for a research fellowship to actually physically come here, so much the better. But the thing that I'm really fighting to preserve is the scholarly conversations that take place in the garden outside the library reading rooms.
We've got time for one more question.
Hi there.
Hi there. How can we as individuals and we as a organization, how can we as individuals and we as an organization be more involved and be more helpful to you?
Well, thank you for asking. So the question is how you as individuals or you as an organisation could become more involved and help. And of course the answer to that is by helping the Huntington in general. You are helping the research division in particular. So those of you who become members or better, members of the Society of Fellows, the annual giving is a critical part of the Huntington's income and makes a difference. Several people in this room have also endowed research fellowships that make it possible for scholars in particular fields to come and work on particular aspects of our collections, and that's immensely gratifying when that helps, when that happens. I would really like to think that the ongoing success of the research programme stimulates more and more curiosity about the kind of things that we do here and encourages people to climb the ladder of involvement, not just from daily admissions, but into memberships, into the Society of Fellows, and then to higher levels of giving. The generosity of the Huntington donor community is really, really striking to me, and it's overwhelmingly local. Overwhelmingly local. And one of the measures of its success as an institution is the way it has been able to attract and retain the loyalty of people just like you.
So Steve, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Can I give this to you as a token of our appreciation?
Well, thank you. That's really lovely. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions. And thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Tom. Quite a treat to have a father and son be our speakers. So next month, we will be back at the San Marino Center. Our speaker on the April 19th meeting will be Aaron Rice, talking about the San Marino Motor Classic coming up. Thank you for coming, and have a good evening.